All right. Western Civ. Let's see what's happening in jolly old England at this time, the time of the Reformation. What's going on in England? Well, last we left off with England in 1453, they had just lost the 100 Years' War. After winning the 100 Years' War for most of the 100 Years' War, they were the losers and driven off the continent in the 100 Years' War, so that wasn't good. And then it went from bad to worse. From 1455 to 1485, England falls into a civil war. This was for Henry VI, the young boy king. Look at your dates there. 30 years of a civil war. That's terrible for a country, having a weak king or a weak series of kings. It finally comes to an end in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, a very famous event. The battle itself isn't that noteworthy, except that one king will replace another. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III, evil Richard III of Shakespearean fame, will be defeated by Henry Tudor. And so you'll have a new king, Henry Tudor, taking over. By the way, in case you watched the news recently, Richard III's body has been recovered, and it turns out that he did have a spinal problem, as is shown in the Shakespeare play Richard III. We're still debating how evil he was, but the physical deformity seems to be there. Henry Tudor now wins the Battle of Bosworth Field and becomes King Henry VII, and this is the start of a new royal family, the Tudor family, starting here with Henry VII. And he becomes a great king. You may never have heard of him before. Surely you've heard of his son, Henry VIII, but Henry VII himself was a great king. And he will begin to control and dominate Parliament. And they will kind of allow this. After 30 years of a civil war, a lot of people recognize we need a powerful king. France is becoming powerful and England's getting left behind. So a lot of people in Parliament will say, yeah, we need a powerful king to stop the civil war. And he does. He will end the civil war, send his armies to snuff out any resistance and unify England. So that's what makes him powerful. At the end of this, he will abolish private armies. This will try to stop civil wars. If all these nobles have to obey the king, it cuts down on civil war, which improves commerce in England itself. So getting rid of private armies. Only the king will have an army. And then we come up to his son, Henry VIII. Well, the son of Henry VII actually had an older brother. The older brother, and you've probably never heard of him before, but the older brother's name is Arthur. There would have been a King Arthur, except that Arthur's going to die. Arthur had married a very powerful woman, expecting to be king, and her name is Catherine of Aragon. So she's from Spain. She's a Spanish princess. This is a union here between England and Spain at a time when when Spain was doing great. Columbus sailed in 1492, and Spain is doing great by 1500. And here's this marriage between Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, and the Prince of England, Arthur. And the problem is they were only married for 3 months when Arthur dies. Arthur died in 1502. So that was not good for England. And the question is, are you going to let Catherine of Aragon go back to Spain, this great find that you got, this great connection to Spain? Are you going to let her go? And they agree not to let her go. In fact, Henry VIII, or Henry, he's not king yet, Henry, the son of Henry VII, will step up and try to marry her. So the marriage of the boy who will be Henry VIII to marry Catherine of Aragon. And there's a question by this, because this powerful woman, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain, try to keep her in England. But the problem with it is that there are Bible verses against this. There are Bible verses against the idea of marrying your brother's widow. And so what they have to try to do is to ask her, well, did you actually have intercourse? And she will say no. And we have to believe her in this. She will stay very religious throughout her whole life, and she wouldn't lie over this. And so she will say, no, he was sick the whole time. We never had intercourse, which is not unusual, not completely improbable in those days. We always think of a marriage and then immediately having intercourse. Well, they didn't always do that amongst royal princes and princesses back then. So the marriage will be done. They'll get the Pope's permission, and there will be a marriage between Henry and Catherine of Aragon, and then Henry VII dies in 1509, and you have a new royal couple there, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, this powerful couple. And perhaps you've heard of the trouble that Henry's going to have with his wife here. Well, they're married in 1509 to the same year. So it's an interesting marriage here, the marriage between Henry and Catherine of Aragon. Now, Henry, because this is going to lead to religious problems. Let's look at Henry's religious beliefs. He is a staunch Catholic. In fact, when he hears about Luther, what Luther is doing in 1517, Henry VIII will actually write about this. He's a learned man, very well educated, and he will write about how Luther is harming the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church will reward him with Defender of the Faith. As he writes this pamphlet promoting and protecting the 7 sacraments, the Catholic Church will reward him as Defender of the Faith. The reason I mention this is that it's very ironic that about what's about to happen. He's about to break with the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church had been rewarding him for what a great believer he was. Well, again, the idea that you might have heard of is that the marriage with Henry VIII was unhappy, and that's not true. That's really not true. They actually were married for 18 years. 18 years, and actually got along really well, and actually had a lot of children, or a lot of births anyway. She had 5 births, but only one daughter survived. Mary Tudor will survive, and as these babies are born and die, Henry VIII begins to wonder about what's happening here. Whose fault is this about the babies? And he begins to consider that maybe she lied. Maybe she did sleep with my brother, have sex with my brother, and I have broken this Bible verse, and I've been cursed now, this verse in Leviticus. So, as this goes on and on, Henry begins to seek a divorce. He's going to need a son. Again, keep in mind how powerful this is, that he needs a son. They've gone through 30 years of civil war. He needs to continue the family line, and she's not having living boys. So he notices one of the maids at court, Anne Boleyn, as you're having trouble with your wife, and here's this young girl coming up. Anne Boleyn, a lady in waiting to the queen, begins to flirt with him. And they begin to dabble with sex. Not intercourse yet. She will not allow herself to have intercourse with him yet. He actually had sex with her sister and had babies actually with her sister. And so Anne was very reluctant to give in to the king, knowing that once he had a baby with her sister and put her sister aside, Anne didn't want the same treatment. So she holds off having actual intercourse with him. Well, while he's seeking divorce, the answer comes back from the Pope of no, you cannot have a divorce. And again, the reason for this is Catherine of Aragon's a powerful woman. This is not just some lady you can kick to the curb. She's powerful in Spain, and then also she is the aunt now of Charles V, and we talked about Charles V, the man, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. So these two, this family. Also, the Pope had made special arrangement earlier for the marriage, to allow the marriage in the first place. And that was back in a time when popes could be bought. But now Luther has done his thing, and popes need to show that they can't be bought. So he does not allow Henry VIII to get a divorce. And again, the Lutherans were already attacking the Pope and his St. Peter's Basilica and desire for money. So as the results come back negative, the Pope will not allow a divorce, will not allow Henry to remarry. Henry is going to do it himself. He's going to call Parliament together and tell them what's happening, and Parliament agrees to this. They need him to have a son. That's the move in Parliament, is that Catherine of Aragon doesn't appear to be having any more children or any more sons, and they've got to have a son for the good of the crown. And so he does this. Henry will break with the Pope. He will create his own church. 1532, the Church of England is created. The king is the head of the church. So you'll cut ties with the Pope, and the King of England will assume that role. By the way, you might have heard of this church, Church of England. It'll also be called the Anglican Church, and as it comes to America, it'll be called the Episcopal Church. Once, especially after the American Revolution, we won't want a Church of England in America, so it'll become the Episcopal Church, with the king in the place of the Pope. And one of the first acts of the Church of England is to grant the king an annulment. This marriage never happened because she must have lied, must have had sex with Arthur, which brought down the curse upon her. And as soon as the annulment comes through, Henry VIII immediately marries Anne Boleyn, and they have intercourse very quickly, and within 9 months, Elizabeth is born. So that's how it happened. The king was ready to procreate with Anne Boleyn, and they will have a child immediately. But it is a girl. They need a boy. By the way, Elizabeth, with her bright red hair, is the spitting image of her father. There's no doubt about who her father is. But Anne Boleyn will have to keep working desperately at times to try to have a boy. Now let's look at the Church of England, Henry's church here. Well, the way he sets it up, he himself will believe he is a defender of Catholicism. He will keep the Catholic rituals. In other words, his church will look like the Catholic Church, just without the Pope. Except as it gets set up now, as time rolls on and Catholics become angry about this, well, the English will step up and say, well, we also are going to use our own Bible. So the English Bible, Wycliffe's Bible, will be pulled out and new translation made, and a new Bible will be asserted, an English Bible. That's going to be different. And then they start, as we get rolling here, they will get rid of relics. The idea of a piece of a bone of somebody or a little piece from history has some kind of magical power to it. That will be done away with. Shrines will be closed, the idea that you can go to a shrine and have some kind of miracle performed. And then for Henry, this is really important to him, abolishing the church courts. England had two court systems back then, had a king's court and a church court. And of course, the church court was much more lenient. If you could, you would throw yourself on the mercy of the church court. Well, those are gone now. There is only the king's church, the king's court system. So, power of the king. Only the king's court can rule, and you'll have much stauncher, harder sentences for people there. So here's your Church of England, basically just taking over where the old Catholic churches were. You'll just have the new churches. They're just called the Church of England, and you don't have to send money to the Pope. Send your money to the King of England. Now, then he does something else. This is going to be huge. A lot of people have been protesting monasteries. The monasteries were of no use anymore. They don't serve a purpose. They're just monks hiding away. The printing press does their job. We don't need monks there anymore. And they're also sitting on some pretty wealthy land. Some of these monasteries are on some wealthy land, and the king will decide that those don't need to exist anymore. They just need to go back to the hand of the king. When he confiscates the monasteries, 1/6 of the land of England had belonged to these monasteries, and now that belongs to him. He, in the role of a pope, basically now will become the richest man in England overnight, and powerful now with his land holdings. And all the money that is being sent into the church will now go directly to the king. So England is going to stay wealthy now. They don't have to give money to the Pope. All money stays in England. Well, there is one voice of dissent. Well, there's many voices of dissent, but there's one powerful voice of dissent. Sir Thomas More says no to all this. He was England's Renaissance man, well known in England by everyone. This is the Erasmus of England. In fact, he and Erasmus were friends. And so this is England's most brightest man. Before all this happened, he had been Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor. So even Henry VIII recognized how bright this man is and made him Lord Chancellor of England. Before all this happened, in 1517, he had actually penned an interesting book called Utopia in 1516, before 1517. The word utopia is from the Greek meaning nowhere. So this place doesn't exist. It's just a make-believe land. And what Sir Thomas More did was basically create a world in which, well, what would be a perfect world? This goes back to like Plato's idea of the Republic. What would be a perfect world? If you could design a perfect world, well, Sir Thomas More says you should just have a simple life. People should work and have a job and take care of their family. Everybody working, everybody sharing the land and sharing their equipment. There would need to be a defense force. You can't get away from that other people would be jealous of this, and so you'll need a defense force to defend this utopia. As far as religion goes, toleration all around. That you can pretty much do what you want. Your mind is your own mind and shouldn't be controlled by anybody. This is quite fascinating, this view of the world. You could see it before Luther, what his views of religion and society were prior to Luther. This book becomes famous, like Erasmus's book, Sir Thomas More's book, this Utopia was quite famous, translated all over Europe, and everyone reading this, that Sir Thomas More, the brightest man in England, has his ideas of how to reform society. In the book itself, he actually draws a little map of his little island and actually creates his own language for the people. Fascinating book. And then Luther comes along, and then Henry VIII comes along, and More is going to change his mind completely. He's going to refuse to take part with this Church of England, Henry VIII's Church of England. He refused the oath. At one point, Henry wanted to make sure everyone was on board, so he demanded people swear an oath to this church, and that's when More says, I won't do it. He would refuse to take the oath. Well, Henry VIII will call this treason, and he'll simply say, well, I didn't say anything. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. How can you call me treason for that? Well, you didn't say yes. And Henry VIII will have him imprisoned, make him sweat it out for a while, and More will not budge, and he will be beheaded in 1535. Henry VIII will lose his best friend and his smartest guy over this issue. Sir Thomas More will become Saint Thomas More 400 years later for his defensive stand against the Church of England. There's a great movie you can watch about this, A Man for All Seasons. It's a play made into a movie. There have been a couple of versions of this lately. In fact, one of them won the Academy Award, the Man for All Seasons movie. Well, meanwhile, while all this is going on with the Church of England, Anne Boleyn's trying desperately to have children, especially a boy, and she's not able to do it, suffering all kinds of miscarriages. There's a great movie called Anne of 1,000 Days, which tells you about how long she is Queen of England, about 1,000 days, about 3 years she is Queen of England before people begin accusing her of things. The accusations start coming in as she's not able to have a boy, and people would like to have her replaced. The accusations are of witchcraft, that she must have beguiled the king in the first place to seduce him, and then adultery, that she is sleeping with other men besides the king, and then also incest, that she is much too friendly with her brother. And when they bring her to trial, all these things will be, accusations will come up, and they'll get witnesses to say all this stuff, and she'll be beheaded at the Tower of London. It's really quite sad, actually. The 1,000 Days of Anne Boleyn. Well, even sadder than that is going to be what happens to Elizabeth. Henry has a daughter by her, and she looks just like the king. So you could accuse her of adultery, and a lot of people accuse that Elizabeth isn't the son of the king. But poor Elizabeth, it's really sad. Her mother executed like that, and her father basically putting her aside. She'll spend the rest of her teenage years exiled to a country estate with a death threat over her head. There could become any day a piece of paper saying, you're a witch, your mother was a witch, and you must die. Well, Henry moves on. The third wife of Henry VIII is a woman named Jane Seymour, and she was put up there by a powerful family. So this is what you're seeing. You're seeing these powerful families start to push their girls toward the king, and she will be married the king. They will have intercourse, and she will actually give birth. She will give birth to a boy, and then she dies. But she does her job. She gives birth to a boy. England has a prince now, Prince Edward VI. Prince Edward. He will eventually be Edward VI when he becomes King of England. So let's go real quickly now. Henry needs a new wife, and so wife number 4 is Anne of Cleves. He will go and connect with some Germans. The Germans are becoming more Protestant now, and he wants a connection with them. And so he will marry a Protestant, a German woman from Cleves. He had seen her portrait, this portrait right here, and said, yeah, she'll do. She comes over to England. They get married. And then almost immediately some problems here, that Henry says that this just won't work. She's too ugly. She's not pretty enough for me. He will call her the Flanders mare, this girl, this horse-faced woman. Well, we're not really sure about this because he's at the age now where maybe he's not able to function like he wants. He has a wound on his leg that's constantly festering. He's overweight. He was very athletic in his youth and very attractive and handsome. And as he gets older, he kind of loses that charm and becomes grumpy and mean. And, maybe he's accusing her of being ugly because of his own problems. So there's a question about Anne of Cleves. Is she really horse-faced, as he says, or is it just on him? But anyway, he will put her aside and say, I cannot be married to her. She's just too ugly. And he will ask for a new wife, and he will get Catherine Howard. So here's another powerful family pushing their girl forward. He will marry Catherine Howard, and then the accusations start to roll in pretty much immediately that she has slept with everyone in court and continues to sleep with everyone in court, and Henry will have her executed. But in this time, the charges were real. She was actually no problem getting witnesses here. She was clearly having adultery in the marriage. Henry VIII, by this point, becomes the joke. Now he is becoming overweight. This is kind of maybe the Henry VIII, the overweight Henry, the comic Henry VIII. It wasn't always like that. In his youth, he was quite powerful, but now he becomes overweight and grumpy and obese. His last wife, Catherine Parr, a good girl, good woman, and she will be a little bit fearing for her life here. But she will basically be his nursemaid. At this point, he is so huge that they've got to move him around with a winch, actually lift him up to move him around, and she just takes care of him. She will outlive him. So these are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And the best way to remember them is a mnemonic: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. The 6 wives of Henry, he only killed 2 of them. And then he dies in 1547. So, what happens now? When you have a king dying, well, you have his son come up. And the son, he has a son, Edward VI now, from 1547 to 1553. So that's about 6 years. This boy, he becomes king at the age of 9, and as you see, he won't live to be much of a teenager. He was very sickly his whole life, this poor boy. And with this boy as king, you have a regency of his uncles. He can't rule by himself, so you'll have these powerful men come to court and rule for him. Well, what happens here is important because under the regency, the radical Protestants start to push the Church of England further away from anything smacking of Catholicism. There's a famous archbishop here, the man in the church just below the king. Archbishop Cranmer begins to push the church away from Catholicism. They'll create their own prayer book to completely break with Catholicism. Everything will be done in English and different. Well, when Edward dies, the next in line seems to be Mary Tudor. Now, the problem with Mary Tudor is that she's been raised by her mother, who was put aside, Catherine of Aragon. So her mother's angry, which makes her very angry, and her mother's angry with the Church of England, and so she is raised extremely Catholic. So you've got a little bit of a problem here. If she becomes Queen of England, she is going to destroy the Church of England. And she made this pretty clear. She's not holding anything back. She was not a liar. And when people asked her, she said, yes, I'll destroy this church. This was an abomination that caused my mother such pain. Well, if you're those radical Protestants, you can't let this woman become queen, can you? So they find someone. They were going to dig through the family tree and find someone, a Protestant. They find Lady Jane Grey, a teenage girl. And they asked her, she is the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. And most importantly, she's a Protestant. She's 16 years old, very well educated, and they asked her, what would you do if you were queen? And she would definitely support the Church of England, and that's what they want to hear. You're going to be the queen. And they will marry her to a young boy, and they will set her up to be queen, and she will be queen for 9 days, the famous Lady Jane Grey, queen for 9 days. It's really sad, because just as she's sitting on her throne, here comes Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor gathered an army and marches on London, and she will now become Bloody Mary. Perhaps you've heard of Mary Tudor, and now her nickname, Bloody Mary. She will enter London with an army, come into the Parliament and just take over, and she will show no moderation. She's angry that they angered the Church of England in the first place, and now she's angry that they've put her aside. So she will definitely now return the Church of England to Catholicism, showing no mercy. Even Lady Jane Grey, this poor young teenager who never did anything, Mary will have her executed. So this is the famous execution of Lady Jane Grey, this poor girl. As